January 28, 1986, 11:39 in the morning. The countdown ends. 7 astronauts, including a 37-year-old high school social studies teacher, are pushed into the sky by 7.3 million pounds of thrust. 73 seconds later, in front of a live television audience that includes millions of American schoolchildren watching from their classrooms, the Space Shuttle Challenger is no longer a vehicle. It is a vapor trail. The official line in the days that follow is that this was a tragic accident, an unforeseeable malfunction, a risk inherent to the dangerous business of space exploration. None of that is true. What the public does not yet know, and what an investigation chaired by Nobel laureate Richard Feynman will eventually drag out into the light, is that the Challenger disaster was not unforeseen. It was not unpredictable. It was the predictable, mathematical, deeply preventable consequence of an organization that chose a political calendar over the laws of physics. To understand what happened, you have to understand the solid rocket boosters. The Space Shuttle is propelled into orbit by 2 enormous solid-fuel rockets that flank the central external tank. Each booster is roughly 45 meters tall, taller than a 14-story building. It cannot be cast as a single piece. It is built from segments, stacked vertically, sealed at each joint. The seal at each joint is the single most important component in the entire booster design. Hot, high-pressure combustion gases at over 5,500 degrees Fahrenheit are pushing outward against those joints throughout the burn. If the seal fails, the gases escape laterally, and the booster becomes a flamethrower aimed sideways at the rest of the spacecraft. NASA's solution to that seal was not a single barrier. It was 2 rubber O-rings, one primary, one backup, pressed into machined grooves around the circumference of the booster joint. The principle was elegant. Pressure inside the booster would push the O-ring outward and seat it firmly into the joint, creating an airtight metal-on-rubber seal. 2 rings meant redundancy. If the first one failed, the second one would catch it. That was the theory. The reality on the morning of January 28th was different. The temperature in central Florida overnight had dropped to -1 degree Celsius, 31 degrees Fahrenheit, below freezing. The launch pad, exposed to the cold air for hours, had developed sheets of ice on its towers. Engineers were brought in at 3 in the morning to attempt to remove the ice. Television cameras showed them with crowbars on the steel structures. The problem was not the ice on the launch tower. The problem was the rubber. Rubber, like all elastomers, becomes stiffer at lower temperatures. At room temperature, the O-ring squishes and seals. At -1 degree Celsius, it is closer to the consistency of hard plastic. It does not deform fast enough to seat into the joint when the pressure spike of ignition arrives. The O-ring had been certified for performance between -40 and +70 degrees Celsius in laboratory conditions. Real flight data told a different story. The solid rocket boosters had flown 24 times before Challenger's 25th flight. Engineers had recovered the boosters from each previous flight after they parachuted into the Atlantic. They had inspected the joints. On more than half of those previous flights, they had found evidence of partial O-ring damage, charring, erosion. Hot gas had been blowing past the primary seal on previous flights. The backup seal had caught it. Every time, so far, the system was being saved by luck. The night before the launch on January 27th, the engineers at Morton Thiokol, the Utah-based contractor that designed and built the solid rocket boosters, were not sleeping. They were on conference calls. The Florida temperature forecast for launch morning had just landed in their inbox. The lowest predicted ambient air temperature ever for a shuttle launch attempt. Multiple senior engineers immediately did the same calculation in their heads. The senior engineer who took the strongest position was Boisjoly, 47 years old. 25 years of aerospace engineering experience. He had been studying the O-ring erosion problem for over a year and had personally written a memo in July 1985 warning that catastrophic O-ring failure was a real possibility. That memo had been filed. Now, on the eve of a launch in unprecedented cold, he was on the phone telling his managers exactly what he had written. Do not launch. Boisjoly's words on that conference call were preserved in the Rogers Commission transcripts later. He said, and I quote, "The rubber would not behave like rubber." He projected slides showing the temperature dependence. He pointed to specific previous flights where partial damage had occurred at significantly warmer temperatures. He told his own management that recommending launch at 31 degrees Fahrenheit was, quote, away from goodness. End quote. Initially, Thiokol's engineering management agreed. They drafted a no-launch recommendation and sent it to NASA. This was the correct, professional, by-the-book engineering response. The data did not support a safe launch. The contractor's official position was to stand down. And then the conference call with NASA happened, and the political weather changed. On the NASA side of the call were managers under enormous schedule pressure. The Challenger flight had been delayed multiple times already. President Reagan was scheduled to deliver the State of the Union address that evening, and the White House had been planning to use the launch as part of the speech. The Teacher in Space program had received massive public attention. Christa McAuliffe was about to become the first private citizen in space. The cancellation of yet another launch was politically unacceptable. The phrase that surfaced during the Rogers Commission hearings, the one that captures the entire crisis in a single line, was uttered by a NASA manager during that conference call. He said, "When do you want me to launch?" "Next April." The implication was unmistakable. A no-launch recommendation now would be career-ending. Thiokol's contract would be reconsidered. Engineering caution was suddenly framed as institutional weakness. Thiokol management asked their engineering team to step out of the room. They convened privately for 30 minutes. When they returned, the recommendation had reversed. They would proceed with the launch. Roger Boisjoly's hands, he said later, were shaking when he heard it. At T-0, 11:39 in the morning, the engines ignite. The ground shakes. Pressure inside each solid rocket booster spikes from atmospheric to 900 psi in a fraction of a second. The metal segments expand. The O-rings are supposed to expand with them and seat into the joint. They do not. At T plus 0.67 seconds, barely 2/3 of a second after ignition, the right solid rocket booster's lower joint releases a puff of dark gray smoke. NASA cameras pointed at that joint capture 9 distinct puffs of smoke in the next 2 seconds. Black smoke means combustion products are leaking out. Hot gas is escaping through a gap that should not exist. For the first 11 seconds of flight, that gap is, in fact, briefly self-healing. As the booster lifts off and the rubber warms slightly under the heat of combustion, soot from the leaking gas itself starts to plug the joint. Aluminum oxide particles from the propellant act as a temporary patch. The shuttle clears the launch pad. The crew, the public, the engineers, all believe the worst is behind them. They are wrong. At T plus 37 seconds, Challenger encounters wind shear in the upper atmosphere. The shuttle's flight control system handles it, but the buffeting forces flex the booster joints. The fragile soot plug that had been sealing the leak shatters. The original gap reopens. Hot pressurized gases at 5,500 degrees Fahrenheit begin escaping again, this time without anything to stop them. At T plus 58 seconds, ground cameras capture a small but distinct flame emerging from the right booster, near the lower segment joint. The flame is pointed inward, toward the external tank. The external tank contains 72,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and 20,000 gallons of liquid oxygen. The flame is acting as a torch on the side of a bomb. At t plus 64 seconds, the strut that connects the lower end of the right solid rocket booster to the external tank fails. The booster is now hanging from only the upper attachment point. It begins rotating outward, away from the shuttle like a barn door swinging open. The crew cabin, riding atop the external tank, feels a slight yaw. They do not yet know they are dying. At t plus 73.114 seconds, the booster's upper attachment fails as well. The free booster pivots violently into the external tank. The tank ruptures. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, instantly mixed, ignite in a fireball that engulfs the entire spacecraft. The orbiter, traveling at 1900 miles per hour, is hit by aerodynamic forces 20 times its design tolerance. It does not explode, it is torn apart. The cabin, with the 7 crew members inside, separates from the disintegrating spacecraft and continues on a ballistic trajectory. Investigators later determined that some, possibly all, of the crew survived the initial breakup. They would have been conscious for the next 2 minutes and 45 seconds, falling at terminal velocity, before impacting the Atlantic Ocean at over 200 miles per hour. 48 hours after the disaster, President Reagan announced the formation of an independent commission to investigate. It would be chaired by former Secretary of State William Rogers. Among its 13 members was a name that NASA, in retrospect, should have feared. Richard Feynman was 67 years old, a Nobel laureate in physics, a member of the Manhattan Project, a theorist who had reshaped quantum electrodynamics. He was also famously, almost compulsively, allergic to bureaucratic nonsense. The story of the Rogers Commission is, in large part, the story of Feynman taking NASA apart in front of television cameras. Feynman quickly identified that NASA's official position on the O-rings was wrong. Internal NASA documents claimed that O-ring resilience was, quote, affected by temperature within acceptable margins, end quote. Feynman read the actual test data. He read the engineer's memos. He understood the physics. The official position was a lie of omission, papered over with bureaucratic language. During a public hearing, broadcast live on national television, Feynman did something a Nobel physicist almost never does in front of cameras. He performed an experiment, live, with props he had bought himself at a hardware store on the way to the hearing. He took a sample of the O-ring rubber, identical to the material used in the shuttle joints. He pulled out a C-clamp. He pulled out a glass of ice water provided by the hearing room. He pinched the O-ring sample between the C-clamp jaws to compress it the way the joint pressure would compress it. He held the compressed sample in the ice water for 30 seconds, around 32 degrees Fahrenheit, almost exactly the temperature of the Challenger launch morning. Then he pulled the C-clamp out. He released the compression. He held the rubber in front of the cameras. It did not spring back. The rubber stayed compressed for several seconds. It had lost its elasticity. The seal it was supposed to make would have been impossible. Feynman quietly said, "I believe that has some significance for our problem." In 30 seconds, with a hardware store C-clamp and a glass of ice water, Richard Feynman had demolished months of NASA's official technical denials. The footage played on every news network in America that night. The O-ring becomes brittle below freezing, period. There was no margin, there was a failure mode. The Rogers Commission's final report, 3 months later, was devastating. It identified the technical cause as exactly what Roger Boisjoly had said it would be. It identified the deeper cause as institutional. NASA, the report said, had a culture of, quote, groupthink, end quote. There had been systematic overestimation of safety margins. There had been suppression of dissenting voices like Boisjoly's. There had been prioritization of schedule over engineering reality. Feynman wrote a personal appendix to the Rogers report. Appendix F, it is one of the most quoted pieces of engineering ethics writing ever produced. He concluded with a single sentence that has been carved into the walls of engineering schools around the world. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations because nature cannot be fooled. Nature cannot be fooled. 7 people did not come home that day because an organization, faced with a choice between its political calendar and the laws of physics, picked the calendar. The engineers warned. The contractor's own technical staff warned. Roger Boisjoly stood up in a meeting and said, "Do not launch." Management overruled him in 30 minutes. Their names: Francis Richard Scobie, Michael John Smith, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, Christa McAuliffe, 5 career astronauts, 1 Hughes aircraft engineer, 1 37-year-old social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, who had been chosen out of 11,000 applicants. They were all dead because of a rubber ring at -1 degree Celsius. The decision-making pathway, when laid out on paper, is brutal in its simplicity. Engineering reality said stop. Engineering culture in writing said stop. Bureaucratic momentum said go. Political pressure said go. Schedule pressure said go. NASA, the agency that had spent decades building a reputation on engineering excellence, authorized the launch. 73 seconds later, the sky rained debris and broken dreams. The pattern that emerged from the Challenger investigation was not unique to NASA. It is not unique to space agencies. It is the failure mode of every complex organization that has ever existed. When economic, political, or career pressure overrides technical judgment, people who never sat in any meeting end up paying. Aviation regulators have it. Pharmaceutical companies have it. Financial institutions have it. Oil platform operators have it. Whenever the engineers say no and management says yes, you eventually get a challenger. The exact technical failure varies. The institutional failure is identical. It is not human error. It is institutional arrogance hiding behind human error. After Challenger, NASA was rebuilt. The solid rocket boosters were redesigned with 3 independent O-rings instead of 2. Engineering hold authority was strengthened. The agency adopted formal protocols, giving any individual engineer the authority to halt a launch. Engineering voices, post-Challenger, were no longer politically negotiable. That fix worked for a while, until 2003, when NASA approved a Space Shuttle Challenger mission despite engineering concerns about foam debris damage to the wing leading edge. Challenger broke up on re-entry. 7 more astronauts died. The Rogers Commission's lessons had not stuck. This is what Challenger means in the long run. It is not a story about a faulty seal in 1986. It is a story about a permanent feature of how complex human organizations make catastrophic mistakes. The next Challenger is already being built somewhere, in a different industry, by managers convinced their schedule matters more than their physics. Reality does not care about deadlines. It does not care about earnings calls. It does not care about election cycles. Physics is law. When you ignore it, the bill always arrives. If this investigation matters to you, subscribe to Buried Truths. Every week, another corporate or institutional cover-up, fully documented, fully sourced. Because the next time someone says we have to launch on schedule, you will know exactly what they mean.